The first thing that must happen immediately is this: you stop making her behavior about you. This sounds simple, but psychologically it is one of the most difficult shifts a man can make. When a narcissistic wife withdraws affection, criticizes without clarity, or suddenly becomes cold and distant, the instinct is to search for what you did wrong. You replay conversations, analyze your tone, and try to correct yourself in hopes of restoring harmony. But this reflex is precisely where your power begins to drain. From a psychological standpoint, narcissistic behavior does not arise as a response to your actions. It emerges from an inner instability that existed long before you. Carl Jung spoke often about projection, the unconscious tendency to place unresolved inner conflicts onto another person. In this dynamic, you are not being reacted to, you are being used as a screen. Her dissatisfaction, her sense of emptiness, her fear of inadequacy, these are projected outward and attached to you. When you internalize them, you unknowingly accept a burden that was never yours to carry. The danger of personalization is not emotional pain alone. It is identity erosion. Each time you assume responsibility for her moods, you subtly reshape yourself to manage them. You become cautious, self-doubting, and overly accommodating. Over time, this creates a psychological imbalance where your sense of self becomes dependent on her approval or emotional state. That is not partnership. It is quiet self-abandonment. Detachment, then, is not cruelty, it is clarity. When you observe her behavior without immediately judging yourself, something shifts. You begin to respond rather than react. You listen without absorbing. You remain present without surrendering your center. This inner separation restores perspective and interrupts the cycle of manipulation, because narcissistic dynamics rely on emotional entanglement to function. The moment you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is actually happening here?" you reclaim your psychological ground. And from that grounded position, real change within you and within the relationship finally becomes possible. Once you stop personalizing her behavior, the next shift becomes possible, regaining psychological authority through emotional neutrality. This is where many men misunderstand the task. They believe authority comes from confrontation, from finally saying the right words, or from asserting dominance. In reality, psychological authority is quieter than that. It comes from not being emotionally pulled off center. A narcissistic dynamic feeds on emotional charge. Defensiveness, guilt, pleading, over-explaining, these are not expressions of strength, even though they may feel active. They are signals of inner disturbance. Carl Jung understood that what controls us emotionally controls us psychologically. When your emotional state becomes predictable and easily triggered, it gives the other person a map to your inner world. Emotional neutrality removes that map. Neutrality does not mean indifference or emotional numbness. It means your internal state is no longer dictated by provocation. You can listen without immediately reacting. You can speak without the urgency to convince. You can disagree without needing to win. This calm consistency sends a powerful, often unsettling message. Your center is no longer negotiable. What happens next is subtle but profound. Without emotional fuel, manipulative patterns begin to collapse. Dramatic swings lose their impact. Accusations fall flat. Silence becomes less threatening. In many cases, the narcissistic partner escalates behavior at this stage, not because neutrality is failing, but because it is working. The system is testing whether you will return to the old emotional role. Here is the deeper truth. Emotional neutrality is not a tactic aimed at her. It is a discipline aimed at yourself. It requires awareness of your own impulses, the urge to defend, to fix, to seek reassurance. Each time you resist those impulses, you strengthen your psychological spine. You begin to operate from choice rather than compulsion. Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole, distinct, and self-governed. Emotional neutrality is a step in that direction. When your emotional life is internally regulated, no one can easily destabilize you. And from that position of inner authority, your presence alone begins to redefine the relationship. When you no longer react emotionally to control, control quietly loses its power. Once emotional neutrality begins to stabilize you, the next essential step is less visible but far more decisive: establishing clear internal boundaries before you attempt any external ones. Most men make the mistake of announcing boundaries they have not yet psychologically accepted themselves. They say what they will no longer tolerate, but inwardly they remain afraid of conflict, abandonment, or emotional withdrawal. In such cases, boundaries collapse the moment pressure is applied. A boundary is not a demand placed on another person. It is a decision you make with yourself. It is the quiet line you draw internally that determines where your responsibility ends and another's begins. Without this inner clarity, every interaction becomes a negotiation driven by emotion rather than principle. Carl Jung understood that what is not consciously defined within us is easily overridden from outside. In a narcissistic dynamic, this lack of internal boundaries is often exploited. Guilt becomes a tool, confusion becomes leverage, emotional appeals blur your judgment. If you have not decided in advance what behavior you will calmly disengage from, you will find yourself explaining, defending, and eventually compromising your own values just to restore short-term peace. That peace, however, always comes at the cost of self-respect. Internal boundaries require self-honesty. You must acknowledge what genuinely exhausts you, what crosses your moral line, and what you are no longer willing to absorb emotionally. This is not about punishment or ultimatums. It is about alignment. When your actions match your inner limits, you regain coherence, and coherence is deeply stabilizing. Once internal boundaries are set, external boundaries emerge naturally. Your tone changes. Your responses become shorter, clearer, and less emotionally charged. You stop negotiating your reality. You don't need to threaten consequences because your consistency communicates them. The other person senses his shift immediately, even if they resist it. Jung emphasized that psychological strength comes from integration, not force. When your inner limits are integrated into your behavior, you no longer need to announce them loudly. They are felt. And when a man is no longer internally divided, when his yes means yes and his no is quietly firm, manipulation loses its entry point. The moment you decide inwardly and without apology where you stand, your life begins to reorganize itself around that truth. Once internal boundaries are firmly in place, a subtle but crucial shift must occur. You stop trying to be understood and begin focusing on being grounded. This is often where intelligent, thoughtful men become trapped. They believe that if they could just explain themselves more clearly, choose better words, present better logic, show enough sincerity, the tension would resolve. But this assumption misunderstands the nature of the dynamic in narcissistic relationships. Understanding is not the goal, control is. Your explanations are not evaluated for truth, but for usefulness. Each attempt to clarify becomes more material to distort, challenge, or emotionally reverse. Carl Jung warned that when the ego seeks validation from an unconscious counterpart, it hands over authority. The need to be understood becomes a vulnerability. Groundedness, by contrast, requires no explanation. It is the state of being internally aligned, where your actions, tone, and presence communicate stability without justification. You speak when necessary, briefly and clearly. You do not argue for your reality. You do not defend your intentions. You allow silence to exist without rushing to fill it. This silence is not weakness. It is psychological confidence. What often unsettles a narcissistic partner is not what you say, but what you no longer say. When you stop over-explaining, you remove the emotional hooks. Conversations shorten. Drama loses momentum. The usual scripts fail to produce the expected reactions. At tea, stage, you may be accused of being distant, cold, or changed. In truth, you have not become less human, you have become less manipulable. Being grounded also means tolerating misunderstanding without rushing to correct it. This is difficult because it challenges the ego's desire to be seen as good, reasonable, or fair. But maturity lies in knowing that your integrity does not require constant external confirmation. Jung saw this as a movement away from persona, the mask we present, to a deeper, more rooted self. When you stop performing for understanding and start standing in your truth, something shifts internally. Your nervous system calms, your words gain weight, your presence becomes steadier. And from that steadiness, influence quietly emerges. When you no longer chase understanding, you discover something far more powerful, unshakable self-respect, as groundedness replaces reactivity. A deeper and often uncomfortable realization follows. Your identity must exist independently of the relationship. In narcissistic dynamics, the erosion of self does not happen all at once. It happens subtly, through compromise after compromise. Abandoned interests, softened opinions, neglected friendships, delayed goals, all justified in the name of keeping peace. Over time, the relationship becomes the central organizing force of your inner world. Carl Jung warned that when a man's sense of self is outsourced, he becomes psychologically dependent. In such a state, approval replaces purpose, and survival replaces growth. A narcissistic partner may unconsciously encourage this narrowing of identity, because a diminished self is easier to manage. The tragedy is that many men mistake his contraction for loyalty or sacrifice. Reclaiming your identity is not rebellion, it is restoration. It means returning to the parts of yourself that existed before the relationship and expanding beyond them. Your work, your physical vitality, your intellectual curiosity, your friendships, your values, these must stand on their own, not as a threat, not as a provocation, but as a declaration of psychological independence. When your life has depth outside the relationship, something fundamental changes. You no longer approach interactions from neediness or fear of loss. You bring choice into the room. This is deeply unsettling to a narcissistic dynamic because it removes leverage. When your sense of meaning does not depend on her reactions, emotional manipulation loses its grip. There may be resistance at this stage. Subtle discouragement, guilt-laced comments, or sudden demands for attention. These are not signs you are doing something wrong. They are signs the system is being rebalanced. Jung observed that individuation often disrupts established relational patterns because growth exposes imbalance. This process also restores something vital, dignity. You begin to feel like a whole person again, not a role being played. Your energy returns. Your decisions become clearer. You are no longer shrinking to be tolerated or expanding to be approved. You simply are. A man with a full life cannot be controlled by emotional scarcity. And when you reclaim your identity, you don't just change the relationship, you change the trajectory of your life. As you reclaim your identity and begin to stand on psychological ground that no longer depends on the relationship, one final reality must be faced without illusion. Change will be resisted. Not occasionally, inevitably. Any system, especially a relational one built on imbalance, reacts when its structure is disturbed. This resistance is not personal, but it will feel deeply personal if you are unprepared. When you stop reacting emotionally, set internal boundaries, speak less, and live more independently, the dynamic shifts. The familiar scripts no longer work. At this point, many men expect relief or mutual adjustment. Instead, they are met with confusion, escalation, or sudden reversals, unexpected affection, renewed promises, emotional vulnerability, or intensified criticism. These are not contradictions, they are attempts to restore equilibrium. Carl Jung understood this as the psyche's resistance to transformation. What has been relied upon, consciously or unconsciously, does not surrender quietly. The narcissistic partner may test your resolve. probe for emotional access, or appeal to your former self through guilt or nostalgia. This is the moment where many men falter, mistaking intensity for intimacy or aggression for reconciliation. The key here is consistency, not rigidity, not coldness. Consistency. You do not need to argue, threaten, or explain. You simply remain aligned with the internal decisions you have already made. Your calm becomes the signal. Your steadiness becomes the boundary. Over time, the emotional storms lose force because they no longer produce the desired response. This phase requires patience and self-trust. Resistance does not mean you are failing. It means the old structure is dissolving. Jung noted that psychological growth often feels destabilizing before it becomes liberating. The temptation is to retreat into familiar discomfort rather than tolerate unfamiliar strength. But growth demands endurance. Eventually, one of two things happens. Either the relationship restructures itself around your newfound stability, or it reveals that it cannot survive without imbalance. In both cases, clarity emerges, and clarity is power. When you no longer fear resistance, you stop being controlled by it. And when you can stand firm without aggression and calm without withdrawal, you discover something rare, freedom that does not depend on anyone else's behavior.